Hi students, I'm going to attempt to give you a quick tutorial over this density laboratory. The density lab is not straightforward, and thus individuals end up having a real hard time trying to figure out exactly what the next step is. This lab is designed to make you think about what the next step will end up being so that you can produce the information, produce the numbers that you really need. Alright, you know that density is equal to mass divided by volume. Anytime you have two of those components, density, mass, or volume, you can determine the third component. And you're going to have to go a roundabout way in order to do that. Right here I have a jar that does not have a set volume on it. We're not sure what it is. Pycnometers are going to end up being devices like this that do have a very specific volume. We can determine the volume of this jar by doing this laboratory. We know that water is going to end up having a very specific density of 0.9970 grams per cubic centimeter. Because we know that, we can determine the volume of this jar because water will mold itself to this particular instrument, and that's the good thing about water. So what we're going to end up wanting to do in the very beginning is taking this jar. We want to make sure that it's clean, that it has absolutely no water inside or outside of it, so we'll dry it, and then we're going to mass it along with its stopper. Alright, we will determine the mass and we will put that information down on the paper. Alright, we will keep that mass at all times. As long as you keep the same stopper, same jar, you're in good shape. You never have to mass it again. Then we're going to end up filling it with water. We'll fill it all the way to the top. We'll turn our stopper in such a way that whenever it pushes in, it's going to force all of the air out, and we're going to make sure that there are no bubbles in it. Bubbles will have a volume of their own, so if there are bubbles caught inside this, they're going to end up disrupting the volume of the jar itself. They'll take up space and you won't get accurate data from that point on. So make sure there's no bubbles in it. We want to dry the outside of it, and then we want to mass it again. Now that you end up having the mass of the jar and the stopper and the jar of the water, we can subtract the jar of the stopper and glass away, and voila, we end up having the mass of the water. Since we know the density of water is 0.9970 grams per cubic centimeter, and we know the mass of the water, we have the two components we need to get the volume. And that's just the first part. So from that point on, we're going to end up finding the mass of an unknown liquid, which is going to be a type of alcohol you guys will have. Y'all won't have all the same ones. So you're going to end up pouring the water out of this. You'll dry it out real good. You're going to pour your alcohol inside. You'll end up making sure that there are no air bubbles in it, forcing it out, and you'll dry the outside of it to make sure that there's no alcohol on the outside surface because that weighs more. Then you'll end up massing it, alright, and you will have two of your components there. You found out what the volume of it is. Now you know what the mass of your alcohol is by doing mass difference, taking the glass and the stopper away from that. So you have your two components to find the density of your unknown liquid. Alright, that is the second step. The third step you're going to end up having now is finding the density of an unknown solid, which is going to end up being a type of metal. We first need to determine what the mass of the metal is, and you'll take your glass, you'll dump out the alcohol as directed by me, your instructor, and you'll dry it out. You'll pour your metal in, which should be roughly 50 grams. Alright, I gave everybody somewhere around 50 grams, but it's not exact. Alright, so everything in here is nice and dry. Your metal should be dry. If it's still wet, then it's going to end up having extra weight and you don't want to use it. Once you find out that, you're going to end up sticking it on the balance. You will determine what the mass of your metal is. Then you're going to end up filling this thing up with water with your metal still inside it. Okay, so now you're going to end up massing. After you dry out the outside, you're going to have the mass of your metal, you have the mass of the water inside, you will also have the mass of the jar and the stopper, those three components. We need to determine what the mass of water is. You've already figured out what the mass of the jar and the stopper is. You've figured out what the mass of the metal is, so the remaining mass is going to be the mass of the water. And once we determine what the mass of the water is, we can figure out how much volume the water is taking up because it is going to fold around the metal and everything else inside here. So once we figure out what the volume of the water is, we will know what the volume of the metal is, because we determine the entire volume of this flask. And once you know what the volume of the metal is, you will be able to determine the density of it, because you've already found out what the mass is. Alright, so there is a way to complete all this. You just have to be very careful, making sure that you take good, accurate measurements, and your volumes and metals will end up matching some of the choices that I've got there for you. Should be exact. Alright guys, that's a quick tutorial. Hopefully you understand and you'll be prepared for the lab next week. Thank you so much. Good to see you. Talk to you then.